The aroma of frying bacon and brewing coffee was not something the German soldier associated with captivity. For years, on the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front or in the scorching sands of North Africa, the concept of a full meal had been reduced to a hard crust of bread, a tin of watery soup, or a shared can of cold meat. Surrender, in the minds of many Wehrmacht troops, was synonymous with death. They had been fed propaganda that painted the Allies, particularly the Americans and the Soviets, as barbarians who would torture, starve, or summarily execute their prisoners. Yet, here was a young lieutenant, captured in Tunisia, standing in a line in a cafeteria in rural Texas, holding a metal tray piled high with scrambled eggs, white bread, sausages, and fruit. He stared at the food, terrified to eat it, convinced it was a trick or a hangman's meal served before his execution. He looked around and saw his comrades eating voraciously, their faces buried in plates of food they hadn't seen in years. This was not the dungeon they had been promised. This was the United States of America in 1943, and for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war, it was the beginning of a surreal existence inside what they would come to call the Golden Cage. As we delve deeper into this incredible story of logistics, diplomacy, and the strange reality of war, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss the unfolding chapters of this historical saga. To understand the shock of that breakfast tray, we must first understand the journey that brought these men to the American heartland. The story of the German POW experience in America is one of the most fascinating and under-discussed logistical feats of World War II. By the end of the war, the United States held nearly 400,000 German soldiers on its soil. But they did not arrive all at once, and the system that greeted them was not built overnight. The first major influx came after the collapse of the Afrika Korps in May 1943. Suddenly, the Allies had over 150,000 prisoners on their hands in North Africa. Great Britain, already strained by years of blockade and rationing, could not possibly feed or house them all. The solution was the vast, untouched interior of the United States. The journey began in the hold of a Liberty ship. For many German soldiers, the voyage across the Atlantic was a time of supreme anxiety. They were packed into the lower decks, often in cramping conditions, though still better than the cattle cars used for transport in Europe. The greatest fear during this crossing was not the American guards, but their own navy. The Atlantic was prowled by U-boat wolf packs, and a torpedo did not discriminate between a ship carrying supplies and a ship carrying German prisoners. There were instances where POWs spent days in terror as depth charges shook the hull, praying that the submarine commander outside knew who was on board. Upon arrival in ports like New York, Boston, or Norfolk, the culture shock began immediately. The first thing they noticed was the skyline. In Europe, cities were blacked out at night to hide from bombers. In America, the cities were ablaze with light. Neon signs flickered, streetlights hummed, and cars moved with headlights on. It was a psychological blow that hit harder than any artillery barrage. It signaled to the prisoners that the enemy they were fighting was not only untouched by the devastation of war, but was operating with a surplus of energy and resources that Germany could no longer imagine. From the ports, the prisoners were loaded onto trains. These were not the boxcars of the Holocaust or the troop transports of the Eastern Front. These were often Pullman passenger cars with cushioned seats. The shades were left up. As the trains rolled westward, the prisoners watched the American landscape unfold. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat, vast herds of cattle, and intact factories billowing smoke. They saw a country that was fully mobilized but completely unscarred. Many German officers later wrote in their diaries that they lost the war the moment they looked out the window of that train. They realized the industrial and agricultural capacity of the United States was simply too great to overcome. The destination was one of the hundreds of camps scattered across the country, mostly in the south and southwest, where the climate was mild to save on heating costs. When the prisoners arrived at camps in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Alabama, they found facilities that looked more like military barracks than prisons. There were fences and guard towers, certainly, but inside the perimeter there was order, cleanliness, and facilities that adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929. The United States government had made a calculated decision regarding the treatment of POWs. This was not born merely out of benevolence, but out of pragmatism and strict legal adherence. The War Department, and specifically the Office of the Provost Marshal General, which oversaw the POW program, operated on the principle that if they treated German prisoners according to the highest standards of the Geneva Convention, the German government would be compelled to treat American POWs in Germany with the same respect. It was a reciprocity policy. Consequently, the order was given. German prisoners were to receive housing, clothing, and food equal in quality and quantity to that of the United States Army personnel stationed at the same camp. This policy led to the culinary shock that defined the early years of the POW experience. The standard U.S. Army ration in 1943 was roughly 4,000 to 4,500 calories a day for a soldier in training or active duty. Therefore, the German prisoners were allotted the same. When the prisoners entered the mess halls for the first time, they were greeted by sights and smells that overwhelmed their senses. The sheer abundance of food was difficult for the prisoners to comprehend. In the German Wehrmacht, rations had been scientifically calculated, but increasingly scarce as the war turned against them. Real coffee had been replaced by substitutes made from chicory or roasted grain. Butter was a luxury. Meat was rationed strictly. White bread was almost non-existent, replaced by the dense, dark Kommissbrot. In the American camps, however, the cafeteria lines offered a different reality. Historical records and menus from camps in 1943 and 1944 show a staggering variety of food. A typical dinner menu might include beef pot roast, mashed potatoes with gravy, buttered peas, corn, lettuce salad with dressing, bread and butter, fruit pudding, and coffee. Breakfasts often consisted of eggs, bacon or ham, dry cereal with milk, fruit juice, toast, and more coffee. The prisoners were fascinated by the white bread. To a German soldier used to heavy rye and whole grain loaves, the soft, airy American white bread tasted like cake. They called it Weissbrot and initially consumed it in massive quantities, though many complained it wasn't filling enough compared to what they were used to. The availability of meat was particularly shocking. In the early years of the program, before the domestic rationing situation in the U.S. tightened, prisoners were served steak, pork chops, and poultry. There are accounts from Camp Hearn in Texas where prisoners were served chicken so frequently that they eventually petitioned the camp commander to serve less chicken and more sausages, a complaint that the American guards found hilarious given the starvation occurring elsewhere in the world. But it wasn't just the main courses. It was the condiments and the extras. Sugar, which was a precious commodity in Europe, was available in bowls on the tables. Salt, pepper, ketchup, and the item that fascinated them the most, peanut butter, were readily available. For many young Germans, this was their first encounter with peanut butter, corn on the cob, and iced tea, the latter being a confusing concept to Europeans who preferred their tea hot. The quality of the food sparked various rumors among the prisoners. The fattening up myth was prevalent in the early months. Some prisoners, particularly those who had been indoctrinated deeply with Nazi propaganda, were suspicious of the American generosity. They whispered to each other that this excessive feeding was a prelude to something sinister. Perhaps they were being fattened up to be sent to labor gangs in the Pacific, or worse, that the Americans were chemically altering the food to sterilize them. It took weeks, sometimes months, for these fears to subside as the routine of camp life set in and no sinister plot revealed itself. The Americans strictly followed the caloric requirements. The Provost Marshal General's office monitored the camps to ensure that the equal quality and quantity rule was not violated. If the American guards were eating turkey for Thanksgiving, the German prisoners ate turkey for Thanksgiving. If the guards had ice cream on Sundays, the prisoners had ice cream. This adherence to the rules went so far that in some camps, prisoners actually gained an average of 15 to 20 pounds within their first few months of captivity. The mess halls were run by the prisoners themselves, under American supervision. The U.S. Army provided the raw ingredients, but the cooking was done by German Army cooks who were among the prisoners. This arrangement allowed the Germans to prepare the food according to their own tastes as much as possible. They learned to adapt American ingredients to German recipes. They used the abundance of flour and sugar to bake cakes and pastries that rivaled the best bakeries in Berlin before the war. They turned the ample supply of ground beef into frikadellen rather than hamburgers. They pickled the vegetables provided to them. This culinary autonomy was a crucial part of maintaining morale and order within the camps. The kitchen became a center of social life. The aroma of baking bread or roasting meat wafting through the barracks created a sense of domestic normalcy that was entirely at odds with their status as prisoners of war. It served the American interests well. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to riot, less likely to try to escape, and more capable of performing the labor that the U.S. government would soon require of them. However, this abundance created a complex psychological landscape for the prisoners. While their bellies were full, their minds were often troubled by the contrast between their condition and the condition of their families back home. They received letters from Germany, censored, of course, but still conveying the grim reality of the air war and the tightening rationing. A soldier might sit down to a plate of roast beef and potatoes in Mississippi while reading a letter from his wife in Hamburg, who was struggling to find milk for their children and hiding in cellars from Allied bombs. This golden cage syndrome induced a deep sense of guilt. They were safe, warm, and well-fed, living better than they had in the Wehrmacht, while their homeland was being incinerated. The Americans, for their part, viewed the feeding of prisoners as a logistical triumph. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for procuring and distributing food, treated the POW camps as just another extension of the Army base network. The efficiency of the American supply chain was on full display. There were no shortages of flour, no lack of meat, no missing shipments of vegetables. The trains arrived on time, the warehouses were stocked, and the refrigerators were cold. This reliability was another subtle form of psychological warfare. It demonstrated to the German soldiers that the American system was functioning perfectly, without strain, reinforcing the idea that defeat was inevitable. It is important to note that the food situation was not uniform across every single day of the war, but the period from 1943 through most of 1944 represents the peak of this abundance. During this time, the prisoners also had access to canteens or PX stores within the camps. They were paid a small wage for their labor, usually 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, which they could spend on extras. And what extras they were! The canteens were stocked with beer, Coca-Cola, chocolate, toiletries, and tobacco. Tobacco, in particular, was a currency of immense value. In the German army, cigarettes were rationed carefully. In the American camps, they seemed limitless. Prisoners could buy packs of popular American brands. They could buy pipes and high-quality tobacco. The availability of beer was also a major morale booster. Although it was strictly regulated and often low-alcohol 3.2 beer, the fact that they could sit in a canteen after a day of work, drink a cold beer, and smoke a cigarette was a luxury that felt almost illicit. The interactions between the prisoners and the American mess sergeants often led to a strange camaraderie centered around food. American guards, who were sometimes older men or those unfit for combat duty, would occasionally trade with the prisoners or share specialized items. There are stories of prisoners baking birthday cakes for the camp commanders, or guards bringing in venison from hunting trips for the German cooks to prepare. These moments of humanity were facilitated by the universal language of a shared meal. But the food was not just about comfort. It was fuel. As the war dragged on, the United States faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas fighting, leaving farms and canneries without workers. The government realized that the hundreds of thousands of idle German prisoners were a massive potential workforce. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners could be made to work, provided the work was not dangerous and had no direct connection to the war operations. Agriculture fit this description perfectly. When the prisoners began to work in the fields, harvesting cotton, picking corn, canning tomatoes, and thinning sugar beets, their caloric needs were reassessed. A man swinging a scythe or lifting crates for 10 hours a day needed energy. The 4,000-calorie diet, originally a matter of protocol, became a matter of necessity. The farmers who contracted the prisoner labor were often required to provide the midday meal. This introduced the prisoners to the local cuisine of the regions where they were held. In the South, German soldiers encountered grits, collard greens, and cornbread served by local farm families. In the Southwest, they tasted chili and beans. Initially, there was resistance. Many Germans found corn, which in Germany was widely considered animal feed, to be unfit for human consumption. They would turn up their noses at sweet corn or cornbread, referring to it as pig food. However, hunger is a persuasive teacher, and the quality of the American sweet corn eventually won many of them over. The farmers, for their part, were often shocked by the appearance of the prisoners. Expecting monsters, they instead found healthy, polite, and often very young men who worked hard. The custom of the farm dinner became a loophole in the strict fraternization rules. While guards were supposed to keep prisoners and civilians apart, it was common for a farmer's wife to set up a long table under a tree and serve the prisoners the same food the family ate. These meals, fried chicken, biscuits, fresh milk, homemade pie, became legendary among the POWs. They wrote about them in their memoirs decades later, describing the kindness of American farm families who fed the enemy as if they were their own sons. One of the most significant aspects of the food experience in 1943 and 1944 was the stark contrast with the situation in the Pacific Theater. While German POWs in America were complaining about too much chicken or the texture of white bread, American POWs held by the Japanese were starving to death, subsisting on handfuls of rice and suffering from beriberi and dysentery. The American public was largely unaware of the full extent of the horrors in the Pacific at this time. But the government knew. The disparity was grotesque, but the U.S. government maintained its adherence to the Geneva Convention with the Germans, hoping against hope that the Red Cross could use this good treatment as leverage to get parcels to Americans in Europe. The Golden Cage was real. It was built on a foundation of American agricultural dominance and adherence to international law. The German prisoners were eating better than the civilians in the United Kingdom, better than the civilians in the Soviet Union, and certainly better than their own families in Germany. They were consuming protein and fats at levels that promoted health and vigor. This physical well-being had a profound effect on the camp culture. It allowed for sports leagues, theater productions, orchestras, and university-style education system to flourish within the camps. You cannot play soccer for 3 hours or study calculus if you are starving. The calories provided by the U.S. Army fueled a vibrant, if confined, society. However, this abundance was not destined to last forever. As the war entered its final, most brutal phase in 1945, and as the concentration camps in Europe were liberated, revealing the true nature of the Nazi regime, the attitude of the American public and the policy of the government would shift. The era of steak and eggs would come to an end, replaced by a harsher reality. But in those first 2 years, the German prisoner of war in America lived in a culinary paradox, a prisoner who ate like a king, fed by the very enemy he had sworn to destroy. This period of plenty served another unintended purpose. It deprogrammed many soldiers. It is hard to maintain the belief that your enemy is a subhuman degenerate when he feeds you better than your own leaders did. It is hard to believe that the German Reich is the supreme power of the world when you are surrounded by a land so rich in resources that it can afford to give butter and sugar to its prisoners. The food was, in its own way, a weapon. It broke the psychological conditioning of the Wehrmacht more effectively than any interrogation could. The logistics of feeding 400,000 men were staggering. Every day, tons of potatoes had to be peeled, thousands of loaves of bread baked, and herds of cattle slaughtered. The waste alone was significant. In the early days, before stricter controls were implemented, the amount of food thrown away in POW camps scandalized the local civilian populations, who were subject to rationing of meat, sugar, and butter. Civilians would see the garbage trucks leaving the camps, laden with half-eaten loaves of bread and cuts of meat, and write angry letters to their congressmen. Why, they asked. Are we skimping on butter for our children while the Nazis are throwing it in the trash? These complaints would eventually gain traction, leading to the Let 'em Eat Spam campaigns and a drastic revision of the food policies. But for the young soldier who arrived in 1943, the memory that would stick with him for the rest of his life was that first tray in the mess hall. The steam rising from the potatoes, the yellow of the scrambled eggs, and the impossible whiteness of the bread. It was the taste of America, and it was the taste of survival. As the sun set over the Texas plains or the Alabama cotton fields, the German prisoners would gather in their barracks, bellies full, smoking American cigarettes, and wonder how a world could be so divided. On one side of the ocean, death and hunger. On this side, a surplus so vast it defied logic. This disconnect was the defining feature of their captivity. They were the guests of the enemy, kept alive and healthy by the industrial might of a nation that was systematically dismantling their own. But the story of food in the American camps is not just one of abundance. It is also a story of the inevitable collision between this abundance and the grim political realities of a world at war. As we move forward, we will explore how the discovery of the Holocaust and the global food crisis of 1945 changed the menu, and how the golden cage began to lose its luster. The garbage cans behind the mess halls of Camp Ellis in Illinois told a story that was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. In late 1944, inspectors found them filled not just with potato peelings or bones, but with whole slices of ham, half-eaten steaks, and loaves of white bread that had barely been touched. At the same time, just a few miles away in the nearby towns, American housewives stood in line for hours with ration books in hand, hoping to secure a meager cut of chuck steak or a quarter-pound of butter for their families. The contrast was stark, visible, and politically explosive. The golden cage had worked too well. The German prisoners, accustomed to the abundance of the American military supply chain, had begun to take it for granted, while the American public, sacrificing for the war effort, watched with growing fury. The era of the banquet was about to crash into the hard reality of total war. As we navigate this dramatic shift from luxury to austerity, and the collision of food and politics, please make sure you are subscribed to the channel. The story of what happened next is a crucial piece of history that is rarely told in such detail. To understand the drastic changes that occurred in 1945, we must look at the home front atmosphere of 1944. The United States was fully mobilized, but the strain was showing. Rationing was a daily struggle for civilians. Meat, sugar, coffee, shoes, and gasoline were strictly controlled. A meatless Tuesday was a patriotic duty. Yet rumors began to circulate in local communities near POW camps. There were whispers that the Nazis were eating better than the GIs fighting in the Pacific, and certainly better than the civilians paying for the war. These were not just rumors. They were facts rooted in the strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Because the prisoners were receiving the standard U.S. Army garrison ration, they were technically entitled to more meat and sugar than a civilian. Local newspapers began to pick up the story. Angry letters flooded the offices of congressmen and senators. One constituent wrote to her senator asking why she had to use margarine while she saw German prisoners loading crates of real butter into their kitchens. Another reported seeing prisoners buying cartons of cigarettes and cases of Coca-Cola at the camp exchange, items that were often out of stock at the local grocery store. The situation was exacerbated by the behavior of some hardline German prisoners. In several camps, ardent Nazis, still confident in a final German victory, would openly mock the American guards for their softness. They would complain if the coffee wasn't hot enough, or if the meat was too fatty. This arrogance, fueled by full bellies, grated on the nerves of the Americans. The reciprocity policy, the idea that treating Germans well would ensure good treatment for Americans, was beginning to feel like a one-sided deal. Reports from escaping Americans or liberated camps in the East suggested that the Germans were not holding up their end of the bargain. American POWs were often marching hundreds of miles in freezing weather with little food, while German POWs in Texas were playing soccer and eating roast beef. The political pressure reached a boiling point in early 1945. The House Military Affairs Committee launched an investigation into the coddling of prisoners. The hearings were heated. The War Department tried to defend its policies, citing the Geneva Convention and the need to protect American boys abroad. But the optics were terrible. The press had a field day with the pampered prisoners narrative. Headlines screamed about "Steak for Nazis" and "The Ritz-Carlton for the enemy." Then came the psychological breaking point, the liberation of the concentration camps. As Allied troops swept into Germany in the spring of 1945, the world saw the images from Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The skeletal figures, the piles of bodies, and the industrial scale of the starvation horrified the American public. The newsreels played in cinemas across the country, often right before the main feature. Americans sat in the dark, watching bulldozer blades push emaciated corpses into mass graves. And then they thought about the German prisoners in their hometowns sitting down to a 4,000-calorie dinner. The mood shifted instantly. The German soldier was no longer viewed as an honorable enemy, caught in a bad situation. He was now seen as a complicit agent of a criminal regime. The distinction between the Wehrmacht and the SS blurred in the public mind. The demand for retribution was deafening, and the easiest way to exact that retribution was through the dinner plate. In May 1945, just days before the official German surrender, the order came down from Washington. The Golden Age was over. The Provost Marshal General issued a directive that fundamentally changed the nutritional landscape of the camps. The order stated that the daily ration for prisoners of war was to be cut immediately. The logic was twofold. First, to appease the angry American public, and second, to address a looming global food crisis. Europe was starving. The infrastructure of the continent was destroyed, and millions of displaced persons were facing famine. The United States had to feed the world, and in that hierarchy of need, the German prisoner was moved to the very bottom. The new policy was explicit. Prisoners were to receive no more than the average civilian population, and the cost of feeding them was to be drastically reduced. The 4,000-calorie diet was slashed. For non-working prisoners, the intake was cut to approximately 2,000 calories. For working prisoners, it was reduced to about 2,500 to 2,800. But it wasn't just the quantity. The quality of the food underwent a radical transformation. Gone were the steaks, the pork chops, and the roasts. In their place came substitute meats. The Quartermaster Corps scoured the inventory for items that American soldiers and civilians generally refused to eat. The prisoners began to receive beef hearts, beef liver, tripe, and fatty cuts of pork. But the most infamous addition to the menu, the one that German veterans would remember with shuddering disgust decades later, was the fish. The U.S. Army had vast stocks of salted herring and other cheap preserved fish that had been rejected by U.S. troops. These were dumped into the POW supply chain. For many Germans, particularly those from inland regions, the salty, bony fish was unpalatable. But they had no choice. The white bread, the cake they had come to love, was replaced. The pure white flour was needed for export to starving Europe. The prisoners were switched to a darker, coarser bread, or, in some cases, cornbread, which many still regarded with suspicion. The luxury items vanished overnight. The sugar bowls were removed from the tables. Butter was replaced with margarine, or simply disappeared. The most crushing blow to morale, however, was the closure of the canteens to the sale of luxury goods. The order came down. No more cigarettes, no more beer, no more Coca-Cola, no more chocolate. The small wages the prisoners earned could no longer be spent on these comforts. For a soldier, tobacco is often more important than food. The sudden withdrawal of cigarettes caused immense stress and agitation within the camps. Prisoners began to smoke dried leaves, tea, or even grass rolled in newspaper. The cigarette economy of the camps collapsed, leading to a black market where a single smuggled cigarette could trade for a week's worth of dessert. The reaction from the prisoners was a mixture of shock, indignation, and self-pity. They called this period the Hunger Years, although physically they were far from starving. They wrote letters home complaining bitterly about the cruelty of the Americans. They claimed they were being treated like animals. The irony of these complaints was completely lost on them. At the very moment they were whining about having to eat beef hearts and margarine, the citizens of Berlin were boiling wallpaper to get the starch out, and millions in the Soviet Union were surviving on potato peels. One particular incident highlights this disconnect. In a camp in Oklahoma, prisoners went on a brief hunger strike to protest the serving of chicken wings and backs, claiming they were awful, fit only for dogs. The camp commander, a hardened American officer who had seen the reports from Europe, was apoplectic. He marched the prisoner representatives into his office, showed them photos of the liberation of Dachau, and told them that if they didn't eat the chicken wings, they would eat nothing. The strike ended within the hour. The whining campaign, as some guards called it, was extensive. Prisoners filed formal complaints with the Red Cross. They cited the Geneva Convention's article on food quality. The International Red Cross, dutifully doing its job, inspected the camps. Their reports from late 1945 are fascinating. The inspectors noted that while the rations had indeed been cut and the menus were less appetizing, the nutritional value was still sufficient to maintain health. They found no evidence of malnutrition, scurvy, or starvation-related diseases. The prisoners were losing weight. The American fat they had gained in 1943 was melting away. But they were healthy. The shift to Spam and leftovers had a specific psychological intent as well. It was part of a broader re-education or denazification program. The Americans realized that they couldn't just feed the Germans democracy. They had to make them understand the cost of their defeat. The removal of privileges was tied to behavior. In some camps, good behavior, participation in democratic discussion groups, watching films about American civics, could earn a prisoner a slight increase in rations or a token for a cigarette. Food became a tool of behavioral modification. Despite the complaints, the American logistical machine kept the prisoners alive and functioning. The famine in the U.S. camps was a famine of luxury, not of necessity. To understand the difference, one only has to look at the fate of German prisoners who were handed over to the French. In 1945 and 1946, as the U.S. began to empty its camps, thousands of prisoners were transferred to French custody, to help rebuild the shattered country. The conditions in the French camps were catastrophic. France was broken and had no food for its own people, let alone for the hated Boche. German prisoners in France truly starved. Many died of malnutrition and disease. Those who had just come from America, complaining about the lack of sugar in their coffee, were suddenly thrust into a nightmare where they had to catch rats to survive. Only then did they realize how good they had had it in the starvation period of the American camps. There was also a distinct regional flavor to the austerity diet in America. In the agricultural camps of the Midwest, prisoners working on farms often bypassed the strict Army regulations. A farmer who needed his corn harvested wasn't going to let his workers faint from lack of energy. The farm dinner loophole remained open. While the camp breakfast and dinner were meager portions of oatmeal and stew, the midday meal provided by the farmer was often still robust. This created a desperate competition among prisoners to get on the work details. Work was no longer just a way to pass the time or earn coupons. It was the only way to get a square meal. This dramatically increased productivity. The lazy strikes of 1943 vanished. Men worked harder than ever because the farmer's wife might bring out sandwiches and lemonade at noon. The peanut butter war is another curious footnote of this era. As meat became scarcer in the camps, the Army looked for cheap protein. They found it in peanuts. Massive quantities of peanut butter were shipped to the camps. For the Germans, who had initially found the paste sticky and strange, it became a lifeline. It was calorie-dense and filling. They learned to eat it by the spoonful. In some camps, it was practically the only source of fat they received. Decades later, former POWs would have a complicated relationship with peanut butter. For some, it was the taste of survival. For others, a reminder of the humiliation of the hunger years. The reduction in rations also led to an increase in ingenious culinary adaptation. With less meat, the German cooks became masters of the stretcher. They would take the small amount of ground beef or spam issued to them and mix it with massive amounts of breadcrumbs, onions, and potatoes to create meatballs or meatloaf that looked substantial even if it was mostly filler. They foraged for greens within the camp perimeter. In camps located in the southwest, prisoners learned to identify edible cacti and local herbs to flavor their bland soups. They were relearning the skills of scavenging that they had forgotten during the years of American plenty. But perhaps the most bitter pill for the prisoners was the visual confirmation of their defeat through the media they were forced to consume. As part of the re-education, they were shown newsreels of the war's end. They saw the ruins of Berlin, Cologne, and Dresden. They saw the soup kitchens in Germany, where their own wives and children were standing in line for a ladle of watery broth. This context made the bad food in America taste like ashes. How could they complain about eating liver and onions when their families were eating tulip bulbs? The guilt returned, heavier than before. The complaints about the food began to die down, not because the food got better, but because the news got worse. By late 1945, the population of the camps began to change. The fanatical Nazis were being segregated, and the process of repatriation was a distant light on the horizon. The food remained basic, strictly utilitarian. The days of beer and steaks were gone forever. The United States government had successfully calibrated the diet to the bare minimum required by law and health standards, balancing the vindictive mood of the public with the legal obligations of the state. it is crucial to analyze the mortality rates during this hard period. Despite the drastic cuts, the mortality rate of German POWs in U.S. custody remained astoundingly low, less than 1%. Compare this to the Soviet camps, where mortality rates could reach 30% or higher, or even the French camps in the immediate post-war chaos. The American system, even when it was trying to be harsh, was incapable of true cruelty. The bureaucratic efficiency that had once provided too much food now ensured that there was just enough. The calories were counted, the vitamins were calculated, and the prisoners survived. This period also solidified the divide between the old prisoners, those captured in Africa in 43, and the new prisoners, those captured in France and Germany in 44 and 45. The old hands remembered the golden days and felt the loss keenly. The new arrivals, who had experienced the collapse of the German supply lines and the starvation at the front, looked at the reduced American ration and thought it was a feast. A soldier captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, who hadn't eaten in 3 days, looked at a tray of herring and cornbread as if it were a banquet. This internal conflict often led to tension in the barracks, with the veterans of the Golden Cage being mocked by the newcomers for their entitlement. The food war in the American camps was a microcosm of the shifting moral landscape of the war itself. It began with a naive attempt at chivalry. Treat them well, and they will treat us well. It evolved into a pragmatic and somewhat vindictive policy of just enough. But even at its worst, the American camp system was a paradise compared to the reality of the rest of the world in 1945. As the harvest of 1945 ended, the German prisoners faced a new uncertainty. The war was over, but they were not going home. The labor shortage in the U.S. was still acute, and there was talk of keeping them for another year or more to help with the transition to a peacetime economy. And looming over them was the threat of being sent not to Hamburg or Munich, but to England or France to work as forced laborers in the ruins. The story of the German POWs in America is approaching its final chapter. We have seen them feast, and we have seen them scrounge. But the final phase of their experience, the delay in repatriation, the secret labor deals between the Allies, and the lasting legacy of their time in the U.S., is perhaps the most poignant. How did these men eventually return to a country that no longer existed? How did they reintegrate into a society that had been completely destroyed? And what did they take with them from America, other than a taste for peanut butter and a knowledge of democracy? The journey isn't over yet. In the next part, we will explore the long road home, the final struggles, and the surprising emotional bonds that persisted between the prisoners and their American captors long after the fences were torn down. The war was officially over. In May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In August 1945, Japan followed suit. The guns fell silent across the globe, and the great cities of the world erupted in celebration. Ticker tape rained down on New York City, and sailors kissed nurses in Times Square. But inside the barbed wire fences of the 500 POW camps scattered across the United States, there was no celebration, only a gnawing anxiety. For the nearly 400,000 German prisoners, the end of the fighting did not mean the end of captivity. In fact, for many, the most difficult chapter of their odyssey was just beginning. The Golden Cage, which had protected them from the horrors of the Eastern Front and the starvation of the Reich, was about to open, but it would not release them into the arms of their families. Instead, it would push them into a new geopolitical twilight zone where they were no longer soldiers, but commodities, human reparations to be bartered in the reconstruction of a broken continent. As we conclude this epic saga of survival, food, and the strange bonds forged in war, please take a final moment to subscribe to the channel. The story of how these men returned home and what they remembered of America is a powerful testament to the complexity of history. To understand the delay in repatriation, one must understand the economic reality of the United States in late 1945. The war had absorbed millions of American men into the armed forces. While they were beginning to demobilize, the agricultural sector was facing a massive labor crisis. The 1945 harvest was looming. Millions of tons of cotton, corn, wheat, and sugar beets needed to be picked. The German prisoners had proven themselves to be an efficient, disciplined, and vital workforce. The lobbying from American farmers was intense. "Don't take our Germans away," they wrote to Washington. "If you send them home now, the crops will rot in the fields." So, a legal loophole was exploited. The Geneva Convention stated that prisoners of war must be repatriated as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. However, technically, a peace treaty had not been signed. Only a surrender had been declared. The state of war legally existed. This allowed the Truman administration to delay the mass repatriation of German POWs until the spring of 1946, keeping them in the U.S. for one final harvest. This final year in America was a strange time. The fraternization rules were relaxed in practice, if not in theory. The prisoners knew they were leaving soon. The guards knew the war was over. The hostility faded. On many farms, the relationship between the German workers and the American families deepened. There are countless recorded instances of farmers taking their German workers into town to buy them new suits or shoes to wear home. In a reversal of the starvation policy of mid-1945, the food situation on the farms improved again, simply because the farmers wanted to send these boys home in good health. They fed them farewell dinners of fried chicken and pie, exchanging addresses and promising to write. But in the spring of 1946, the trains began to move east again. The camps were emptied one by one. The prisoners were packed onto transport ships in New York and Hampton Roads. The mood on the docks was jubilant. They saw the Statue of Liberty fading into the mist and believed with all their hearts that the next land they would see would be Bremerhaven or Hamburg. They were going home to rebuild their lives. They were wrong. Unbeknownst to the prisoners, the Allies had made a secret agreement. France and the United Kingdom, whose infrastructures had been decimated by the war, demanded labor to rebuild. They argued that since Germany had caused the destruction, German muscle should repair it. The United States, eager to offload the logistical burden of housing 400,000 men and needing to maintain good relations with its allies, agreed to transfer hundreds of thousands of these prisoners not to Germany, but to the custody of France and Britain. The realization hit the prisoners in the middle of the Atlantic or upon docking. The ship's loudspeakers would crackle to life, announcing that they were docking in Le Havre, Liverpool, or Marseille. The despair was absolute. Men who had survived the war, survived the ocean crossing, and worked for years in American fields, broke down and wept. They felt betrayed. They had been told by their American guards that they were going home. This perceived betrayal would be the one lasting scar on their opinion of the United States, a feeling that they had been sold like cattle. The transfer to French custody, in particular, was a shock to the system that many would never forget. France in 1946 was a nation in ruins. It had been stripped bare by the Nazi occupation and then battered by the liberation battles. There was barely enough food for the French population. The infrastructure was chaotic. When the well-fed prisoners from America arrived, carrying their duffel bags filled with American cigarettes and wearing decent boots, they were thrust into camps that were little more than mud fields surrounded by wire. The American rations were gone. In the French camps, the daily calorie count dropped to near starvation levels, often below 1,000 calories a day. The men who had complained about eating Spam and cornbread in Texas were now eating soup made from grass and potato skins. Disease ran rampant. The prisoners were put to work in dangerous conditions, including the terrifying task of clearing millions of landmines from the French beaches and countryside, a violation of the Geneva Convention that was overlooked in the fervor of the post-war chaos. The physical decline was rapid. The prisoners who had arrived from America looking like athletes, tanned and muscular from farm work, withered away. Within months, they looked like the ragged survivors of the Eastern Front. This period, which lasted for many until 1947 or even 1948, was the true dark night of their captivity. In their memoirs, they often delineate their time clearly: the heaven of America and the hell of France. However, eventually, the gates did open. By 1947 and 1948, the pressure to repatriate the men grew too strong to ignore. The Cold War was heating up. The U.S. and Britain needed West Germany to be a stable ally against the Soviet Union, not a nation of embittered slave laborers. The trains finally headed for the German border. The Heimkehr, homecoming, was a traumatic experience. These men had left a Germany that, while at war, was still a functioning state with beautiful cities. They returned to a moonscape. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt. These were no longer cities, but piles of rubble. The landmarks they knew were gone. The houses they grew up in were dust. But the greatest shock was the human condition. The returning POWs, even after their hardship in France, were often in better physical shape than the civilians who had survived the hunger winter of 1946-1947 in Germany. They found their wives and children living in cellars, dressed in rags, and suffering from chronic malnutrition. The ghost soldiers of the Wehrmacht returned to a land of ghosts. It was in this moment of total despair that the legacy of the Golden Cage truly manifested itself, and in a way that no one could have predicted. The connections forged in the cotton fields of Alabama and the cornfields of Nebraska suddenly came alive. Back in the United States, the farmers who had employed these men began to wonder what had happened to their Germans. Letters began to arrive in rural mailboxes across America. They were written on scraps of paper, in broken English. "Dear Mr. Smith," they would read, "I am home. My house is gone. My children have no shoes. We have no flour. Please help." The response from the American heartland was extraordinary. The same farmers who had sent their sons to fight the Nazis, the same families who had feared the monsters in 1943, began to pack boxes. They went to the local general store and bought flour, sugar, coffee, canned meat, and clothes. They wrapped them in brown paper and shipped them to addresses in the ruins of the Third Reich. This was the era of the care package. both the official organization and the private initiative of thousands of Americans. For a German family in 1947, receiving a package from America was like receiving a miracle. The smell of real coffee, the taste of Hershey's chocolate, the texture of new wool. These were sensory reminders that civilization still existed. One former POW who had worked on a farm in Minnesota recalled the day a package arrived from his former employer. "We opened it on the kitchen table," he said. There was a bag of white flour. My wife started to cry. She hadn't seen white flour in 6 years. We baked a cake. It tasted like America. These packages did more than feed people. They healed the psychological wounds of the war. They transformed the image of the American from a conqueror into a savior. The resentment over the betrayal of the transfer to France began to fade, replaced by gratitude for the individual acts of kindness. The food that had once been a source of fattening up prisoners was now the cement of a new alliance. As the years passed and West Germany rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, the Wirtschaftswunder, the former POWs, played a crucial role. They were the men who had seen the power of American democracy and industry up close. They had lived in a society where the government answered to the people, where the press was mostly free, and where efficiency was king. They brought these values into the new German Republic. Many of them maintained correspondence with their American host families for decades. In the 1960s and 70s, a new phenomenon occurred. Former POWs, now prosperous businessmen or engineers, began to travel back to the United States as tourists. They didn't go to Times Square or Hollywood. They rented cars and drove to tiny towns in Texas, Arkansas, and Kansas. They knocked on the doors of farmhouses where they had once picked cotton. The reunions were emotional. Old men embraced in driveways. The former guard and the former prisoner sat on porches, drinking iced tea, reminiscing about the strange days when they were enemies on paper but partners in the harvest. They visited the sites of the old camps. Most of the barracks were gone, sold off for lumber, or reclaimed by nature, leaving only the concrete foundations of the mess halls. Standing on those concrete slabs, the Germans would tell their children, "Here is where I ate the best meal of my life. Here is where I learned that the enemy was human." There is a profound irony in the story of the German POWs in America. The Nazi leadership had terrified its soldiers with tales of American brutality, warning them that surrender meant death. Instead, for 400,000 men, surrender meant survival. It meant escaping the meat grinder of the war and entering a world of suspended animation where the biggest concern was not a Soviet bullet, but the boredom of the barracks and the strangeness of peanut butter. The food was the central character in this drama. It was the instrument of shock, the tool of management, the source of conflict, and ultimately, the bridge of reconciliation. The sheer caloric surplus of the United States did more to denazify these men than any lecture series. It is hard to hate a nation that feeds you better than your own master race ever did. In the dusty archives of small-town museums across the United States, you can still find the artifacts of this time. Carvings made from peach pits, paintings of American landscapes done on scrap wood, and letters written in fading ink. They tell the story of a unique moment in history when the vastness of the American continent absorbed the wreckage of the European war, and, through a mixture of bureaucracy, abundance, and simple human decency turned enemies into friends. The golden cage was, in the end, a crucible. The men who emerged from it were changed forever. They carried with them the memory of the wide open skies, the strange taste of corn, and the realization that humanity can survive even the darkest of times if there is enough bread to break together. As we look back on this history, it serves as a reminder of the power of logistics and humanity in warfare. The decision to feed the enemy was one of the most strategic victories the United States ever won, echoing through generations of German-American relations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of World War II's most fascinating untold stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We have many more stories from the archives to share with you. Until next time.